Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. And also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on my Twitter. Handle there is Isaac R. Levin. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get to our guest. I have coffee, so I think we should just get started. So today I'm really excited for my conversation today. My conversation is Joe Beda. Joe, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Beda. I am currently unemployed, so I'm a bum. But have done a lot of open source and have been in the technology industry, something like 25 years, something like that. So,
I
yeah.
thought I thought we agreed you were going to be a semi-retired technologist.
That's I think that's my the official title I gave myself because I don't know
Sure,
what the future holds. I don't know where
sure.
things are going to take me. So, I'm not ready to declare full-time retirement yet.
Well, I mean, I think everybody in tech would really appreciate you coming back and inventing something really exciting again. So yeah, so I think I'd love to get our conversation going kind of with, I like to ask my guests to start off, like, what's your tech origin story? Like, do you remember a point in time, like, you came across technology and you kind of figured out, like, this is it? This is what I want to be messing around with the rest of my life?
It was always there for me as the answer. My father was a programmer, and so I'm second generation. My younger daughter is very much into programming, so she's third generation, which is kind of weird thing in our industry. But my dad started a company. He was an entrepreneur also. Back when the U.S. Postal Service was introducing zip codes, if you were a big company, had a mailing list, and you started putting zip codes on your addresses, you'd get a break in postage. That was an incentive to have people to start using zip codes across these big
Interesting.
sort of catalog shippers or whatever. And so they started a company running on IBM mainframes, 360s, to essentially take these mailing lists and add zip codes to them so that, and it was a very straightforward type of thing. Hey, you spend so much money with us, we'll add zip codes, and then you get a postage break type of thing where, as a business, it really penciled out. And so, his company was relatively small, ended up getting acquired. And so, you know, as through all that, computers have always been a part of my life. They've always been in the house. I had an IBM PC Junior at one point growing up playing King's Quest. I mean, like I'm dating myself for sure here, but so as I went through high school, did a lot of computer stuff. And then I went to college, and I'm like, I want to do something different. Thinking I wanted to do sort of mechanical engineering, but it's
Sure.
one of those things where you just sort of revert to the mean. And so I ended up, getting a CS degree out of college and then coming into the industry and doing my thing. So as far as a path goes, I had a relatively boring, straightforward, sort of traditional path. It's like, did computers my, whole life, did it in high school, got a CS degree, joined Microsoft out of college, right? So it's
Sure.
like, it doesn't get more plain vanilla than that.
Yeah, I still think there are some interesting things though, because at least, and I don't know if you relate to the same thing. I'm a similar thing. Like I started building web pages. Like that dates me about how old I am. Like I started building web pages in high school, and I just was like, this is really really cool. So I convinced my parents to get a computer and all that sort of stuff. And I think one of the things that I've noticed about myself and a lot of the people that I've talked to is like natural tinkerers, like really interested in how stuff is made, interested in kind of, I guess, like modifying or manipulating things to kind of do what you want. Like I remember very vividly, like taking apart my remote control cars and like trying to put them back together. I did it with the computer right when I got it. Like day two, I took it apart. My dad was like, "Fix this thing right now." Like, do you have that similar feeling where like I don't know if like the term now is maker or like tinkerer, but like what do you kind of have some similar traits?
I definitely have those traits. I like, you know, um, like my pastime these days is watching YouTube videos of people doing woodworking and stuff, and I live
Yeah,
vicariously through them. And and I start doing a little bit of that myself. I need to make my peace with the fact that I'm not as good as I think I am from watching a lot of YouTube. But it's interesting because I think there are a lot of folks in our industry that do have that sort of, you know, maker, sort of builder type of mentality. I think it's funny, the movie Office Space,
Sure.
at the end he ends up like digging ditches and he's like, yeah, this is like there's a certain sort of like satisfaction in doing real work and moving real atoms versus just, changing bits on a spinning rust or whatever.
Right.
But I also think there's a lot of folks in our industry that view this more as an abstract mathematical puzzle. And I think,
Yeah.
um, one of the things that I've seen, as I've, taught my own kids about computers, as I've worked with a lot of folks new to the industry, is that there's really a spectrum for how people learn about this stuff. There are some folks who, are, I think gravitate towards being more systems programmers, where it's like, I want to dig deep and understand
Yeah.
the bedrock of the systems that I'm building on as far deep as I need to go, right? And so whether that's hardware, whether that's, reading the libraries or the kernel or whatever.
Yeah. A
And then
friend of
there's
mine.
other folks that just want to get stuff done, right?
Yeah.
And so I often refer to this as depth first versus breadth first, right? There are
Sure.
people who really want to go deep, and then there's folks who are like, I want to get the results out there, and that's what I'm really focused on. And
Yeah. Like,
there's enough room for everybody in the industry for sure.
I keep on interrupting you because I
Sorry, oh, I'm
had
sorry, I
something.
keep talking.
No, 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 no. It's fine. Like your back end sort of persona, I guess you'd call it, right? Like a friend of mine always says, like all we're doing is convincing sand to be smart, right? Like at the end of the day, right? Like you think about that, like at the nuclear level, like we're just literally convincing like pieces of the Earth that have been around for millennia, like to you know deploy Kubernetes onto many, many, many things, right? But I think your point is very interesting too, because at least in the last, I don't know, probably 10 years that I've seen in tech, like there's been all these other things that that go against that sort of credos. Like I remember you had to have math. Like you had to have like you had to take, whether it be limits in infinite series or like some like weird like algebraic math to like, oh, this is what you need to really understand how computers work. Nowadays, like there's far more people that are just creative types. Like, folks that you give them a wireframe or you give them an idea and they build an amazing wireframe and amazing site and they honestly don't care about the sand.
Yeah.
Like they're just using their skills and creativity to be able to make something really amazing. And I think that there's a little bit of inkling to in creativeness with software in general. Like you have to have a creative mind. Otherwise, like the algorithms that you're gonna write or the designs you're gonna make, like it's gonna be far more challenging for you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think, I don't think necessarily having a deep math background is necessary these days. I think there's definitely certain disciplines where it's helpful. Like I think it's hard to go into say machine learning or data analysis
Sure.
or without having a good foundational, grounding on that stuff. And that's not a place where I have a lot of expertise. What I would say is that there's a couple of things that I think bind everybody in the industry together. The first is stubbornness. I mean, like any sort of programming is just banging your head against the wall until you
Yep.
figure stuff out. And it's just that's a rite of passage that I think all of us go through. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how prepared you are, it doesn't matter what your pedigree is. There will be hours spent figuring out a bug, figuring out a configuration issue. Like, and it's just and being able to power through that is a fundamental skill that's necessary in our world. And then I think there's another aspect of it which, you know, um, is really we were talking about this before we started streaming, is this idea of craftsmanship.
Yep.
I think, by and large, and there's always exceptions to the rule, but I think a lot of technologists, we want to be proud of the stuff that we're building. We want it to actually stand the test of time. And it's more than just making business graphs go up and to the right. It's actually about building something that we're not ashamed to show to our peers, right? And I
Sure.
think there is, and I think, that is often, I think, a disconnect between sort of the business people and the technologists, is that idea of craftsmanship, that idea of longevity, and a lot of the frictions that I think we often feel in our jobs is really around like, look, even if nobody sees this, I want to do this right. So okay, so speaking of makers, like I watched this guy who's just the calmest thing ever, do pottery on YouTube.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And he talks about how he spends a lot of time actually finishing the bottom of his pieces because that's where the craftsmanship really shows, right? You
Sure.
know, he's essentially making sure that he pays attention to the things that you won't see
Hmm.
because it's important. And I think there's a lot of us that feel that way, and that's that level of craftsmanship that I think permeates, what we do and binds us together with that maker ethos.
Yeah, I think it's like it's about a pride thing too. And this isn't to say that everybody needs to, like, every technology needs to take absolute pride in their work, but the ones, at least in my opinion, like the ones that, like, they're passionate about technology and passionate about the work they do. You can work in tech and not be passionate about it, and that's totally fine. But if you are passionate about it, it's the things, the underlying details that the customer is never going to see, right? But it's going to make the life of another engineer better. Maybe it's going to make the life
Yeah.
of testers easier. Maybe it's the life of SREs easier, whatever, right? Like, there is some value in having that want to have it be perfect, which is also a problem, right? Because
Yeah, it
perfection,
definitely gets you in trouble.
yeah, because perfection, as everybody knows, is the number one problem I see in being able to get anything done. Like, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and, like, we were on the stream earlier, and I was messing with my cameras, like, why do I look so blurry right now? It's literally, who cares, right? At the end of the day.
Exactly.
I would love to kind of, so you said you did the I guess, the quote unquote the classic route into technology, right? You fell in love with it early. You went to university, studied computer science. You got a job at Microsoft. What did you do at Microsoft? And, like, is there
Yeah.
anything that you took with you from your time there and you kind of carried it through the rest of your career?
Oh, for sure. So I did a couple of internships when I was in college at Microsoft, working on this defunct product on Office called Team Manager, and then working for the NT team doing some 3D graphic stuff. So live translation of OpenGL to DirectX back in like '96 as an intern project. So that was kind of fun.
Interesting.
Um, but when I joined, I interviewed well, and so I had a choice between joining the NT kernel team, um, hardcore technologists, sort of the classic sort of hyper aggressive Microsoft, or joining the Internet Explorer team. And this was in '97,
Sure.
and right around when like IE3, IE4 was being done. And I'm like, I don't know if this internet thing's going to go anywhere, but like it definitely felt like joining that team was the right move, just because when you see a lot of motion, when you see a lot of excitement, that's where a lot of the opportunities are. And so I think one of the themes that I see through my career is that chaos can be uncomfortable,
Yeah.
but also that's where there's opportunity to have impact. And so if you always navigate towards well-defined areas, well-defined, mature teams, you can have a great career, but you're not necessarily going to get those sort of breakout opportunities that you're going to see if you're in a more chaotic area. And so I chose chaos and joined the Internet Explorer team. And I did that for about 7 or 8 years at Microsoft. Internet Explorer, I did a lot of the core data structures and the rendering engine, and then a lot of the IE team got rolled over into doing some of the UI frameworks for Windows, what became Vista, Longhorn at the time. And so I got involved in that. About halfway through that cycle, I left and joined Google, right around the Google IPO. Um, and a lot of my colleagues at the time is like, why are you going to join this little advertising company? That's a stupid thing to do. But it ended up working out okay. Google was an interesting company to join at that time. They had, and I don't know what I think about this honestly, but they had this theory that engineers were fungible and that like a
Mm,
smart person, you could throw them into anything and they could figure it out and they'd actually be successful. And I think that's definitely true for a certain set of engineers. But at that time, I joined Google with no clue whatsoever what I was going to work on.
sure.
But I did know some of the people that I was going to be working with. And so I think that's another sort of constant across the career is that, I definitely lean towards picking who I work with more than what I work on.
Sure.
Um, which is a non-obvious thing, but on a day-to-day basis, that's the type of thing that's going to have the greatest impact on your job satisfaction is the people that you're working with. I ended up doing a bunch of real-time communication stuff, Google Talk, hooking Google up to the telephone system, Switched off of that, did some machine learning for ads stuff, kind of paying my way. Had our second kid, came back, and I just couldn't make myself care about ads anymore, and so um, started doing a lot of the infrastructure cloud,
Hmm.
stuff. So that became Google Cloud Storage, BigQuery, and then I took the lead in starting Google Compute Engine. Saw that up and through, and then like once we got that there, it's like, okay, what's next? That led to joining with some other folks and starting Kubernetes,
Yeah.
and we did that. I took a year and a half off to sort of figure out what's next, and was an entrepreneur in residence with a VC firm, and then started a startup with a coworker from Google, Craig McLucky, another Kubernetes co-founder. That was Heptio. Did that for a couple of years, sold that to VMware about 3 or 4 years ago, and recently retired from that and figuring out what my future looks like. So that's my career in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's safe to say that that's a large like swath of things, right? Like, and I'm not gonna try to unpack each individual thing chronologically, but there are a couple things that I'd love to point out, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Like the idea of starting shipping browsers, right? Like I see that especially during the time of like IE in that time, it was very, I'd imagine, very very contentious, right? Like about like getting the browser as effective as possible because at that point in time browser wars has started to kind of build up. You started to have other companies build out these sort of things to run the same, get the internet on Windows, right? Like what was the, at least in your view, like the internal sort of discussion around that whole thing?
Well, I think it's easy to look at the browser now and talk about the web platform,
Yeah.
and recognize that many people, they open their computer, they open their browser, and they never look at anything else.
Yep.
And so, actually, before we started the Google Cloud infrastructure stuff, we dabbled with starting to get what became Chromebooks up and running.
Sure.
There were some politics around locations because I'm up here in Seattle. The Chrome group was down in Mountain View, and so that didn't pan out. And so like doing the cloud stuff was kind of our plan B. But the it's clear that the web platform is a platform. It is something that really can encompass so many of the experiences that you use with your computer. And there's very few places where, these days you have to go outside the web. I mean, they're not disappearing completely, but the web really is all encompassing. That was not obvious back in 97. But, and I think this is something like, your first couple of jobs in the industry really do help shape how you view things. Microsoft through and through and through and through is a platform and developer company.
Yep.
And we can all laugh at Ballmer getting up on stage yelling developers, developers, developers.
So
But at the
funny.
end of the day, he's not wrong. It's like he's funny looking and sweaty, and Ballmer is Ballmer. But this focus on platforms, this focus on developers is, the engine that drove Microsoft. And Microsoft very much saw that in the browsers also. And so I think, there was a recognition at that time how high the stakes were around doing the browser, and how it could be something that doesn't necessarily supplant Windows, but actually drives Windows back into the background, right? And so at that time, famously, Mark Andreessen, Netscape, big
Hmm.
competitor at the time, said that the goal was to reduce Windows to being a set of poorly debugged device drivers, right? And that was what was at stake with the browser. And so that view of the browser as being a platform, that view of platforms being critical, the sort of flywheel of building a developer-based platform, that's something that really got instilled in me
Yeah.
super early in the industry. And you can see how that sort of like across Google
Sure.
and then Kubernetes, that really influenced me, even if it was a different domain, cloud versus browsers. There's still a lot in common in terms of viewing it as a developer platform and the dynamics of what it takes to be successful as a platform.
Yeah, I mean, at least to me, the browser is something that it's absolutely absurd. Like the complexity that goes into it. Like it's so complex now that, like, at least I know that native mobile development is a thing, but there are so many apps that are literally just wrappers for websites, right? And like when you think about it like that, like the browser has to be so flexible to be able to do all these things, right? I think, you know, you mentioned something I thought was very interesting about, you've worked on a lot of things that are kind of like the underlying framework of how a lot of technology is, and not to drum up like, oh my gosh, Joe, you're some sort of savant or whatever. But I think it's very, very interesting to say, like, especially through your career progression, you've run into, I guess, challenges that have existed in the software industry, the technology industry, and you've been like, oh, okay, well, why don't we just throw a bunch of really interesting ideas at the wall, right? And I'd love to kind of get your thought, like going to Google for Microsoft. I imagine I'd love to talk about that, but we don't have to at this time unless you want to. But I
Oh no,
think,
I'm happy to go into the
yeah,
details
I'd
there. There's a
imagine
lot
that.
to talk about
I
there.
imagine that being you mentioned it very, very briefly, right? Like it was an ad company. To be honest, it still is an ad company, but they have some side businesses that are pretty profitable too. Like going from that, like you said, the developers sort of mindset to, like you said, engineers are kind of fungible, right? Like how is that? Especially being an engineer.
Well, I think, first off, there are common threads that you see through a lot of this stuff. Just your first point here, and I think two things is that I would encourage everybody to go out and read the Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems. And I think recognizing, I think from a career perspective, but also in terms of being successful within the job, understanding that nothing stands alone, and that what we do, and what we take part of is sits inside of a larger framework of systems. And so we both design systems, but we sit within systems. And so, a lot of times technology purists want to think about, oh, the code and the computer, that's all that matters. Well, that's in context of larger society. That's in context of the business. That's in context of the larger technology trends that are happening. Nothing really sits in a vacuum. So, um, and what you see is when you start viewing the world through that lens, there are mirrors of sort of the systems and the interactions that play out in, say, something like the browser to the cloud industry, right? I mean,
Sure.
not the same, but you definitely see echoes of these things, both at the technical level and at the larger business level. That also then informed my career choices. I think, when we were starting Heptio, my goal was, you start a company and everybody likes to think that they have it planned out, but the truth is that nobody knows how a startup is going to play out. And early stage VCs know that also. So they tend
Sure.
to bet on people as much as ideas. But my take on it was I want to navigate towards target rich waters. I don't know what's going to happen, but my spidey sense says that there's a lot of opportunity in this area because, timing and technology and business and, all these things are converging where I think this is going to be a really important, successful area. And so that systems level thinking really actually plays there. Um, Now, going from Microsoft to Google was really interesting. A big part of it is that I was, career-wise, I was stuck in the middle of the Windows machine. What had
Sure.
been that chaotic opportunity mill that was the browser had started to slow down. And we were in the middle of the Longhorn Vista cycle, which was kind of a brutal slog. And I'm like, from career growth perspective, you know, nobody gets promoted and there's not going to be a real shakeup until this thing ships. It's going to be a
Yep.
couple years out. And you start playing the movie and you're like, I'm just not sure this is where the opportunity is. Um, Also, it was clear that like, hey, I had a lot of experience of what it means to actually build the web on the client side.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to build the web on the server side? And at that time, Microsoft was not the place to learn that stuff. It was very much Google understood what it took to build stuff on the server side. And so that was some of my thinking in terms of moving towards Google. And it was both stressful and invigorating to make that big a change. So I would encourage everybody in their career, don't be afraid to jump into the unknown. I think a lot of folks get really comfortable in their current job. They know everything. They're the store of institutional knowledge. They feel very secure because they have such history there. Um, but they don't necessarily feel secure like they could do it again. And I think that there's something to be said for, wiping the slate clean and taking everything that you've learned but applying it in a new place in a new way. And that's really what I did as I joined Google. You know, learn the server side stuff, completely different culture in so many ways, different business models. There was so much to learn there. And I think it really made me a better engineer, a better business person to be able to actually go through that experience. And so don't be afraid of actually those, taking on those new experiences and expanding the basis that you're using to actually draw from.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the things that I'm very guilty of is getting bored too quickly with things. And that's probably not fair to say, but like I typically I'll try to find new things at a job that excite me. And I think that's that kind of doubles up on what you just said, right? Where it's like you have to always be, whether it be career related and you want to be able to grow in your career, or do you just want to do fun stuff, right? Like, you know, and it's crazy now that Windows ships like every week, but that's a whole different conversation, right? Like, um, like being a part of like a 3 or 4 or 5 year long slog to ship an operating system, like you're 2 years into it, and you're not even halfway. Like, okay, so what else can I work on here? Um, like it, and just for reference, like I was taking a look at your LinkedIn earlier today, and like you started working on WPF stuff, which
Yeah.
for folks that aren't aware, that's kind of like the underlying um, like design mechanism for a lot of the way Windows looked at the time and still
Yeah.
does. And you can build WPF apps and all that sort of great stuff.
Yeah, for,
Like,
for those not familiar, it's Windows Presentation
yes,
Foundation. The code name at the time was Avalon. But yeah,
yeah,
that was a journey.
yeah, and you said something that interested me because you're talking about building apps for like the operating system apps for the client, right? And then working at Google, it's like talking about building apps for the web because Google, I'm guessing at the time, saw like, look, everybody's gonna have computers for sure, but everybody uses a browser to do all of their work anyway, whether it be checking their email or purchasing items or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's safe to say that there are a handful of these big cloud companies, right? Of the three of them, one has a deep rooted history in building, like you said, developer services, tools that run the client. Another one, which full disclosure is my employer, built a cloud because we have this amazing like storefront and we have all these great things that we've built. We should figure out ways to sell this to customers because they'll take advantage of it. And then, you know, on your former employer, Google, we have all of this infrastructure that we've built to make all these ancillary tools run really, really well. So why don't we sell that too? So it's like two of them were very much like born in the cloud sort of ideas, right? And the other one was kind of got into the cloud because they saw an opportunity to extend the development experience past the client. And is that safe to say, like from your experience when you were at Google, like the born in the cloud idea, which is really cheesy, but
Yeah, and I think, I mean, cloud is a fascinating area because you say, like, what are the ingredients that make a successful cloud? I think having the technology base is one thing,
mm-hmm.
being able to translate that and make that be available to customers is another thing, right? And so that's like, and then I think there's a there's a logistics scalability aspect of it
Yeah.
too that comes into play. I think one of the fascinating things that I learned as we were doing GCE is that profitability of cloud really comes down to inventory management. If you think about a computer kind of like a banana, you know, um, uh, computer cycles spoil, right? It's like,
Yep.
once the time passes, that computer cycle, if it's used, it's used. If it's not, it's spoiled, and you
Yep.
don't get any profit from it. And so, running a cloud very much is a logistics exercise of making sure that you have the right amount of capacity in the right place at the right
Mm-hmm.
time, which really played to a lot of Amazon's strengths there. And so I think being able to take something that could be, if you're not careful, low margin, and manage it in a way so that you can maximize those margins is a competency that Amazon brought. Whereas Google knows how to build stuff at scale, can do fascinating things with it. but didn't necessarily have, the connection to customers that Microsoft has, or the logistics expertise that Amazon has. And so it's really interesting to see how the different companies come at it from different directions.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating too, like, because if you look at all the clouds, right, or not all the clouds, the three big clouds, because I'm opinionated on the clouds, right? Um, they all go about solving the problem substantially differently too, because I think at the core, their reasoning for there being a cloud is substantially different, right? Like I think your comment about Google is really spot on, right? I think at the end of the day, if you can build things at scale, why not help other people build things at scale? And if you can make money doing so, like that's awesome,
Yeah.
right? Um, I'd love to kind of go into some of the stuff that you did at Google because I think we're all very very dependent on a lot of the things that you helped build at Google, like the compute engine. I think is really really interesting specifically because for folks that don't know, like GCE is at the end of the day, like, is it safe to say it powers basically like all of the services that Google runs, right? Like, is that
It's
fair to
more
say? Yeah.
complicated than that, is
Okay.
what I would
Sure.
say.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to sort of go into the way that
Please,
this
please
stuff works.
do. Please do.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
my eyes roll in the back of my head, it means that you've gone way past my level of understanding, and we'll get back there. But
So fundamentally, I think it's important to recognize that most of the infrastructure built at Google was built for Googlers. Um, and when we talk about scale, and I think this is something that's important as you're selling to enterprises, there's the aspect of scale in terms of the number of machines, the number of requests per second that you're dealing with, what we think of as engineers as scale. But then there's the aspect of scale around how many teams, how many customers, how many accounts do you have? So, and then there's a related aspect of what is the trust model between those different teams there. And so a lot of the stuff within Google was very much built for internal Google usage, where the scale of the number of teams scales with the number of teams at Google, right? In the thousands, tens of thousands, probably is what I would guess. Um, Whereas if you look at something that was built from the get-go for the public, like how many accounts there are at Amazon, I'm sure they're not going to tell you, but like it's got to be in the millions, right? That's a
sure.
different scale point to be able to work at there. And and the security model is much more fine-grained, I would say, within Google because you
Mm-hmm.
want teams to be able to share resources, whereas you generally want to have stronger, more obvious walls when you're talking about stuff built for the public. So there's some differences there. The internal Google stuff to start out with was all built, eventually evolved to be built on Borg, which is essentially running containers, not Docker containers, but using a lot of the same technologies under the
Sure.
covers in a very fluent shared, infrastructure system. And so when I joined Google and up until we did GCE, there were very, very, very few places where virtual machines were used at Google.
Sure.
In fact, virtual machines and virtualization was definitely sort of looked down on within the company because it felt like it was a little bit of a heavy-handed hammer when dealing with a lot of the problems that you were facing. And so what we ended up doing was building GCE on top of Borg, and so you had
Mm-hmm.
VMs running on top of containers. And then eventually, we built Kubernetes, and I can go into some of the reasoning there,
Sure.
which was then containers running inside of those VMs. So you had sort of containers running in VMs, running on containers, running on physical machines. Is ended up being
Yeah.
the where we ended up. But so there was a lot of shared infrastructure between GCE and the rest of Google. But and I'm sure that there are services running on GCE now. Um, but the initial goal was to build something that was much more attuned for what external customers wanted
Yeah.
versus where internal customers were inside of Google. I remember the first time I demoed bringing up a VM and SSHing into it for my director at the time, who had just got sort of shifted around, and uh, I showed him this stuff, and he's like, "Okay, now what?" Right? Because it's so
Yeah.
fascinating. Like in the cloud, it's like, "Oh, I brought up a VM, I can SSH into it." that's clearly a level. And then so much of what we do is answering that now what, whether you're using Puppet Chef, Cloud Init, Kubernetes, all these things are actually that now what on the other side of that VM.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating. I just always assumed as an outsider that, oh, like this is like GCE is a byproduct of having to build all of these services at scale that the entire planet is dependent upon. So might as well just spin it out into some sort of skew, right? Interesting to say that the approach was almost like, what are our customers looking for? Like, what are our customers need? How can we bring value to our customers because we have expertise in being able to scale out apps? That's definitely a very interesting approach. Like, is there a particular reason from your remembering, like, why it's like, okay, this is they just shipped the infrastructure of Google and tried to make that a service?
There were a lot of folks that were pushing for just shipping the infrastructure of Google and making that a service. And I think to some degree that was the thinking behind App Engine. Now, App Engine wasn't exactly the infrastructure of Google, but it was much closer to some of the point of view there. And uh, and now shipping Google, like giving end users direct access to Borg,
Sure.
there were folks pushing for that. I didn't think that was a path forward, and I still think that would have been a mistake. So my take on it, and I think this was, so number one, like you asked about moving from Microsoft to Google. One of the things to recognize is that Microsoft at the time, and still there's an undercurrent of this today, culture-wise is incredibly aggressive. It is an aggressive type of thing. If you're doing something inside of Microsoft at that time and people thought it was a bad idea, it's like, that's the stupidest effing thing I've ever heard. How do you even have a job here? That's the type of feedback that you would get at Microsoft at the time.
Sure.
Google, on the other hand, at that time was very passive aggressive.
Mm,
If you saw somebody doing something and you didn't like what they were doing, you just kind of ignore them and hope they go away.
yeah.
A lot of people would build stuff, they'd go to ship, and they'd find out they didn't have the support to get the resources to ship. So that was, and I think Google still has that undercurrent of passive aggressive. We use that with cloud to our advantage. We build VMs and compute engine, and a lot of people inside the company are like, that's a stupid idea. If we ignore them, they'll go away. And being up here in Seattle versus being down in Mountain View definitely helped us there. There was a lot of out of sight, out of mind. We ended up being right, and the company ended up betting on it, and we were, ahead of the game because of that.
Hmm.
But there was a certain amount of, like, we were out on a limb building something that might have been rejected by the company and might have been killed. But I looked at where the trends were going. I looked at, what Amazon was doing, and I knew it was the right place for Google to head that direction, me and some other folks. And so we did it, and it ended up panning out. But yeah, there was a lot of discussion around building something for customers with VMs versus taking what Google was already doing and exposing it. And you'll see this in Google Cloud, right? There is an undercurrent of hubris with Google, much less so now with folks like TK coming in, where, hey, you're doing it wrong. We know the right way to do this.
Sure.
Um, and they may be right, but also that's not a great way to actually build a business and sell to people. And so
Yeah.
there was very much like by doing GCE and starting with VMs, we met people where they were at. And then by doing Kubernetes, it's like, okay, and now we can talk about, hey, this might be the right way to do it. Now we can argue whether Kubernetes is the right way or not. But, it started from this common basis that was the
Sure.
VM that was really shared in concept with what we had already seen proven out with AWS. Now, to do that, though, I mean, the amount of, like, Google had no virtualization technology or team, so we had to build that up. We had no virtual networking inside of Google. Everything was essentially a flat, 10 dot space with security measures to break things up, but there was no essentially overlay separate sort of virtual networking system that we needed to build out. Google did not use network block devices. Everything was over specialized APIs, similar
Sure.
in concept a little bit to S3. And so we had to build up GCE persistent disks, the equivalent to EBS.
Yeah.
Uh, there was not a lot of infrastructure for building developer focused APIs inside of Google. So we had to do a lot around that. So like GCE was like, we had to do a lot of what I like to call punching trees to actually
Sure.
get that thing up and running, right? Where we were starting from scratch. I wish it had been as easy as uh, just exposing what Google was already doing externally.
Sure, sure. But I think, one thing that we'll talk about this, one of the things that's very, very interesting, like you probably took a lot of those learnings is in the process of building or in shipping GC that you're like, there's so many pain points here. So then you transition to what's next, right? Which is, I'm guessing at the time you're seeing the space, you see the infamous video, the first ever demo of Docker, right, where the guy is he's hitting a console, and all of a sudden like, oh, I have a container spun up, and going through all of that, like, okay, this is something that's very, very interesting. At what point in time did you realize, or you and folks that worked on that initially realized, like, this is something that the entire like software industry is going to need once containers become as popular as they are?
I think, there were a couple of drivers there for us starting Kubernetes. So the first one is that inside of Google, there had been a reorganization where all the cloud stuff was consolidated with what was essentially the technical infrastructure group. The stuff that we're building folks for Googlers got consolidated with the folks that were building stuff for external folks. And
Sure.
so we had this problem where most of the world is using VMs.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody inside of Google uses VMs. Everybody inside of Google uses something that, if you squint, has a lot in common with Kubernetes. Nobody outside of Google, to a large degree, was really using anything like that. I mean, there was Mesos, that was starting to come into play there, but by and large, nobody was using anything like Borg.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we had this problem. How do we actually converge these streams? How do we get Googlers and external customers using the same thing?
Sure.
And so that ended up being, one of the things that drove us to make Kubernetes. The next thing is that as we looked at the set of technologies that Google was good at, those things were really built around a lot of the assumptions that ended up being around containers. The idea
Yep.
of being able to dynamically scale things up and down to, microservices with things like gRPC between them, to, more specialized cloud native data stores, and moving away from things like NFS. Those were all things that Google was good at. And we wanted to build a world that really played to that. And so those were a lot of the things that actually led into building Kubernetes. Now, we looked at Docker, and the way that Docker actually approached containers was different than how Google used it internally.
Mm.
Some pros and cons, but I think, Docker did an amazing job of really crystallizing and making accessible the idea of what a container is.
Yes.
The advantage that we had with Google is that we saw the next step. Brendan, one of my co-founders with Kubernetes, like to say is that everybody had the same pieces of the puzzle, but because we had the experience inside of Google with Borg, because we had the experience of seeing how this stuff played out, we kind of had the picture on the front of the box. And
Sure.
so we were able to look at things like Docker and understand, hey, you can take these pieces, use these things over here, bring these things together and start building something that is sort of, when you look at the cloud native ecosystem that we're in now, brings a lot of that stuff together. And we're not done there. There's still missing
Yeah.
pieces of that thing that we're pulling together. But that was the advantage that we had as we were starting Kubernetes, and GKE and the other
Yep.
parts of that ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that you hit the nail on the head, right? Like, and not to say that Kubernetes is perfect. I think a lot of people would jump in and say, well, Kubernetes is not quite perfect. But I think one thing I think that you called out is that complexity becomes very, 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 very a hard problem to solve, right? And if there's any sort of mechanisms in there that can obfuscate some of the underlying infrastructure related things of, okay, I have all these containers running, I need service discovery, I need secrets management, I need all these things, I need mesh, I need all this stuff. Like, why can't there be a system that's sole responsibility is to orchestrate all of this, right? And like, that's an oversimplification of what Kubernetes does, obviously, But I think as we get more and more to this point of like, okay, I want to be able to save as much money as possible because containers are cheaper than VMs. I want to have the ability to scale, right? Because everybody wants to scale. Like tools become very, very important to help along that journey. Like when you've actually had like a POC in place, like at what point in time did you folks figure out, okay, this is something that's really, really going to help?
I think, we had confidence that this was the right direction
Sure.
from the get-go based on the experiences with Borg. And so I think, we definitely had, you know, maybe a overinflated sense of confidence, but we definitely felt like, hey, this has to happen. I mean, but rewind a little bit the points that you're making. I think, couple of observations there. Number one is that I think whenever you look at a problem space, whether we're talking about, running applications or what have you, um, there's a garbage truck outside. Hopefully
No
it's not too loud.
worries.
Um, there's what I would call essential complexity and accidental complexity. And so I think that there's a lot in this space, whether we're talking about, networking, storage, disaster recovery, or sort of resiliency, uh, uh, communication, security, service discovery, or like all these things end up being necessary complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve. And now there's definitely places in Kubernetes where we have accidental complexity. I think it's probably still too hard to set up. It could be easier. There's, some parts of the API were probably, not done right. I think, some of the services stuff. So there's mistakes that were made, right? So there's a mix of these things. But I think one of the things that we see is that a lot of folks, if you're not using Kubernetes, and you have to solve the same problems, which is a big if, because not everybody has to solve the types of problems that Kubernetes helps you solve. It's likely that you're going to recreate something that looks a little bit like Kubernetes, but do it in a crappy way.
Sure. Sure.
And not only are you going to do it in a crappy way, you're going to do it in a way that only you or your organization knows about, which means that if you bring in somebody new off the street into your team, they're going to have to start from zero to be able to actually
Yeah.
learn all this stuff. Whereas if you're building on top of something like Kubernetes, there is starting to be a shared understanding and a skill set that you can hire from for running and interacting with that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting your comments you make about like, if you try to build your own orchestration mechanism, right? Like I think a lot of folks, obviously before Kubernetes, built something like Kubernetes, right? And I think that the problem that Kubernetes solved is like, okay, so now all these people, all these companies that have built a version of orchestration or some mechanism to amplify all these underlying infrastructure problems into one solution, like now they can just use this. I think a lot of the things that I see in the industry related to Kubernetes is, okay, I'm a developer. This Kubernetes thing becomes very, very easy to talk about, but very, very challenging to implement, right? So, like, what are some of the things that you would love? Maybe is something that you could have fixed a long time ago, or something that you see now. Like, how can Kubernetes be more accessible to folks?
Um, oh man, that's a tough thing.
We got
So
it.
the,
We,
I
we
think
have as much time as you need, Joe.
I think the first thing to recognize is that you know we see this trend in this world of DevOps, right? And I'm sure you can find somebody who will claim that they have the definition of what DevOps is, but a lot of it is breaking down walls between what you do when you're writing code versus what you do when you're deploying and managing that code running in production.
Sure.
And and oftentimes this gets misinterpreted, assuming that there is somebody that knows everything about everything. And so, when we talk about full stack engineer, again, I don't know what that means, but it could be everything from you're doing the front end to how to actually deploy something onto EC2 and actually manage which OS or version of Ubuntu that you're running, and and do kernel upgrades, right? And that's a tall order there.
Sure. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we're seeing with cloud in general, but also with sort of platforms like Kubernetes or systems like Kubernetes, is that we can now start splitting that up. And so what Kubernetes does is it actually provides an API with a set of abstractions, And there's two roles. There's the role of maintaining that API and the stuff that goes below it. And then there's the role of being able to use that API to be able to deploy and manage applications. And so I think there's the platform SRE role, and then there's the application SRE role. And this split across these things is something that's still evolving. And I think where people get in trouble is they assume that they have to know everything about both sides of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think I don't know if we could have done it differently, but I really think that folks find the most success, when they're clear about, hey, I want to first learn how to use Kubernetes. So you go and you start up an EKS cluster or a GKE cluster, or, pitching VMware, a TKG cluster, right? You start one of these things up. Now you can use Kubernetes to start accelerating things. That's a different skill set than being like, okay, now I want to run Kubernetes on bare metal, or I want to run my own version of Kubernetes on EC2 because I need to do things that EKS doesn't do. That's a different skill level there. And so I think that, encouraging folks not to worry about how the sausage is made under the covers, but just use the system. Again, breadth first, depth first. I think that's the first thing. And then the next thing is that start simple, right? I think you mentioned like let's take service mesh, for example. Service mesh adds a lot of value, but it adds a lot of complexity to these systems also. You can be very successful with Kubernetes without a service mesh. And I think folks get themselves in trouble when they assume that I have to do everything all at once versus starting simple. In fact, what I would encourage folks to do is ignore Kubernetes, containerize your app, have a bunch of bash scripts on a single host to actually get your thing running. And then once you outgrow that, then you start bringing in something like Kubernetes, right? Because you got to learn how to package up your application as a container. That's a skill. You got to learn how to actually use Kubernetes. That's a skill. You have to learn how to deal with the networking. That's a skill. So there's all this stuff. And if you can do that more incrementally, you're going to be better off. But I think a lot of the hype, a lot of the excitement convinced folks that they have to do the entire stack, everything all at once, versus, easing their way into it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I would love to chat about just for a few minutes. Like you mentioned something that's very, very poignant, right? Like all this excitement around it because it solves the problem, supposedly, right? First off, what's the problem and why is this thing going to solve it? That's a whole different conversation. But I think a lot of people have like that fear of missing out where they're like, oh, everybody's using this container thing, everybody's using microservice architecture, everybody's using Kubernetes, I have to do it. And they jump into it and then they're lost very, very quickly. And I think one of the problems is I have this conversation whenever I talk to customers, like whenever they say like, oh, I'm using containers or I'm using Kubernetes or whatever, it's like, and I ask them like, why do you think that's important? And most people can't even answer that question, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a fault of folks like me who talk about it to customers, folks like you who invented the damn thing. Like it's very like when we talk about these sort of things, there needs to be this little note saying, oh, by the way, like everybody who talks about this stuff publicly knows it fairly well. So getting into I want to play around with it, it's challenging. But I will say one thing about Kubernetes. It created an industry in and of itself, right? Like the amount of companies
for good or ill, yeah.
Yeah. The amount of companies that have taken Kubernetes and built services like Kubernetes as a service, for instance, or like, oh, we're gonna build a single control plane on top and use Kubernetes as underlying infrastructure. Like the amount of startups that I've seen in the last like 3 years, it's like, oh, we use Kubernetes under the hood and we make Kubernetes easy for customers because Kubernetes is too hard. And then there's companies that they focus on professional services around Kubernetes. I don't know if you have any familiarity with that at all. But I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as like it spun up this kind of micro industry similar to like JavaScript, right? Like JavaScript has like this underlying community ecosystem inside of technology where there's professional services, there's frameworks, there's all this stuff. And Kubernetes has the same thing. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, so I have this talk, and you can, Google it, and there's various recordings talking about how Kubernetes is a platform.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a mismatch here between what Kubernetes is and what a lot of folks assume Kubernetes is.
Yep.
a lot of people out there, what they want is an internal platform that allows development teams to go from idea to running code in as smooth and transparent a way as possible, um, while also maintaining the control that they need as a responsible organization. Right? That is kind of the holy grail. That's what I was building at VMware with Tanzu. That's where a lot of this stuff is going. How do
Mm-hmm.
you actually provide enterprises with that solution for empowering and enabling application teams to move faster in a safe way?
Yep.
Uh, Kubernetes can be part of that solution, but it's really more of a raw building blocks. It's
Yep.
like the difference between, a Linux distribution and the Linux kernel, right?
Yep.
The Linux kernel, important piece of the puzzle, but there's a whole lot that goes into it beyond the kernel.
Yep.
Um, and so I think, that's both good and bad. I think we see an amazing amount of fascinating, innovative things being done with Kubernetes outside of that sort of mainstream application team acceleration type of play. The intersection of, say, Kubernetes and edge computing is fascinating, and is something that's still evolving there. Um, but I think there is that mismatch around sort of what is Kubernetes versus what do customers need, and that gap of actually sort of, the more specialized you get, the more narrow your customer base becomes. And so there's always this challenge around building something relatively generic that requires customers to adapt to it versus building something that is very much custom built for the customer. And that's a huge solution space. And anytime when you have a huge solution space without an obvious answer, I think it's a great place for startups to be able to experiment, to try stuff out, see what resonates, see what doesn't resonate,
Yep.
and go from there. And I think that's um, innovation is messy like that. Like I like to say, you look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they have this landscape chart that I'm sure everybody's seen. It's
Sure.
outrageous of all the projects and the companies and the products that are related to anything cloud native. It's absolutely overwhelming
Yes.
and intimidating for somebody coming at this. And so that's why I say start simple is
Yep.
the way to go. But that messiness for me is a sign of innovation, right? Like that
Sure.
chaos, like bringing it back to the start of the company, that chaos is opportunity. And I think, that's the startups thrive in chaos. They
Yep.
thrive in places where the answer is not clear. And I think that's why we're seeing so many startups in this space. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of, I've watched that presentation that, so I pasted it in the link, and I'll have it in the show notes as well. Um, like the platform of platforms, right? Like I love the idea of, you even have services that exist in cloud providers that all they do is just provide a mechanism to sit on top of Kubernetes without you even worrying about the Kubernetes-ness, right?
Yeah.
Because Kubernetes in and of itself allows systems to be more effective, right? But customer might not care about that. All the customer wants to be able to do is deploy their app in their app. Like if I get 4 million requests in the next second, it scales up. If I have a bunch of different endpoints, they can all talk to each other without me violating cores or some other nonsense, right? Like, but at the end of the day, like, do I really need that hammer for this thumbtack, right? If I'm just trying to deploy an app that a lot of people use, sure, Kubernetes is a great option, but give me something on top of Kubernetes that can really, really empower me to deploy my app and take all the advantage of it without having to run, be well versed in kubectl commands and all that sort of stuff, right? I think that
Yeah.
there's something really, really interesting about using Kubernetes as that foundational block to something else, right? And I think that's probably the next step in its evolution, right? Is that Kubernetes gets completely obfuscated, but it's the underlying
Yeah. The
platform.
interesting thing is
Yeah,
what we build with Kubernetes, not Kubernetes itself.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty safe to say. And I think, is it safe to say that you have a emotional investment in Kubernetes for the rest of your life? Like, I mean, you're always, good, bad, or indifferent, you're always going to be attached to it, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating thing. I mean, like I said earlier, I'm not afraid to jump into new things
yeah,
and reinvent myself. And I also think that, to do anything big in this industry, it does take a couple of years to actually make your mark, right? And
yeah,
so, there's there's a certain amount of banging your head against the wall, to be able to ship something like GCE or Kubernetes or whatever. Uh, I didn't mean to become sort of a, cloud computing specialist. It just kind of happened,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's definitely going to be a part of my career in some way, shape, or form moving forward. But I don't feel bound by it either. I think, there's tons of opportunity out there in adjacent spaces, and I'm not afraid to sort of, you know, leave that behind and reinvent myself again if that's what makes sense for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up our conversation. So, it's been an hour. I really appreciate your time, Joe. Did you have any parting words that you'd like? Hey, everybody. I just wanted to come on and say that at the end of the stream, there was some rendering issues. So, the last minute or so of my chat with Joe got corrupted and we weren't able to recover it. But if you have any questions, feel free to check out the show notes, and we'll see you next time on Coffee and Open Source. Take care.